It's been all about two things, individuals and innovation. I call it I squared, so to speak, because those are my principles. If you kind of follow what I'm trying to do, it's about individuals, about innovation. And, government has a role in playing to guardrails and ensuring that there are competitive markets. But what I really want to do is empower individuals.
That's U.S. Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon. He is a political internet pioneer. Since he was first elected to the Senate in 1996, he has fought for personal digital rights and against corporate and company censorship and for sensible limits on government secrecy. I'm Cindy Cohn, the Executive Director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
And I'm Jason Kelley, EFF's Activism Director. This is our podcast series, How to Fix the Internet.
The idea behind this show is that we're trying to make our digital lives better. And sometimes when we think about the lawmakers in our country, we often think of the conflict and fighting and people who just don't get it when it comes to how digital works. But there are also some people in the legislatures who have worked to enact real progress.
Our guest this week is one of the giants in the political fight for internet freedom for several decades now. Senator Wyden played a critical role in the passage of Section 230, a pillar of online freedom of speech that has recently been coming under attack from many different sides. And he introduced the first Senate net neutrality bill back in 2006. He's consistently pushed back against mass surveillance and pushed for a strong Fourth Amendment. And over the years, he's consistently fought for many of the things that we're fighting for here at EFF as well.
Our conversation takes a look back at some of the major milestones of his career, decisions that have directly impacted all of our online lives. And we talked about the challenges of getting Section 230 passed into law in the first place. But more recently, Senator Wyden also talks about why he was strongly opposed to laws like FOSTA SESTA, which undermine the space that Section 230 creates for some online speakers, using the cover of trying to stop sex trafficking on the internet.
But like us at EFF, Senator Wyden is focusing on the battles happening right now in Congress that could have a fundamental impact on our online lives. When he was elected in the 90s, the focus was on the explosion and rapid expansion of the internet. And now he's thinking about the rapid expansion of artificial intelligence and how we can make sure that we put the individual before the profits of corporations when it comes to AI.
Our conversation covers a lot of ground, but we wanted to start with Senator Wyden's own view of what a good tech future would look like for all of us.
Well, it's one that empowers the individual. Consistently, the battles around here are between big interest groups. And what I want to do is see the individual have more power and big corporations and big government have less as it relates to communications.
Yeah, so what would that look like for an ordinary user? What kinds of things might be different?
What we have, for example, is faster adoption of new products and services for people showing greater trust in emergency technologies. We build on the motivations that have been behind my privacy bills. The Fourth Amendment is not for sale, for example, Section 230, Algorithm Accountability Act. Cindy, in each one of these, it's been all about two things, individuals and innovation.
I'm wondering if you're surprised by the way that things have turned out in any specific instance. You had a lot of responsibility for some really important legislation for CDA 230, scaling back some NSA spying issues, helping to stop SOPA PIPA, which are all, really important to EFF and to a lot of our listeners and supporters. But I'm wondering if, despite that, you've seen surprises in where we are that you didn't expect.
I didn't expect to have so many opponents across the political spectrum for Section 230.
Yep.
I knew we would have some, but nothing has been the subject of more misinformation than 230. You had Donald Trump, the President of the United States, lying about Section 230 over and over again. I don't think Donald Trump would know what Section 230 was if it hit him in the head, but he was always lying about vote by mail and all those kinds of things. And huge corporate interests like big cable and legacy media have bankrolled massive lobbying and PR campaigns against 230. since they saw user-created content and the ability of regular people to be heard as a threat to their top-down model, all those big guys have been trying to invent reasons to oppose 230 that I could not have dreamed of. So I'm not saying, I don't think Chris Cox would say it either, that the law is perfect. But when I think about it, it's really a tool for individuals, people without power, without clout, without lobbies, without big checkbooks. And, a lot of people come up to me and say, oh, if you're not in public life, 230 will finally disappear and all this kind of thing. And I said, I think you're underestimating the power of people to really see what this was all about, which was something very new, a very great opportunity, but still based on a fundamental principle that the individual would be responsible for what they posted in this whole new medium. And in the United States, individual responsibility carries a lot of weight.
I so agree. And I think that one of the things that we've seen with 230, but with a lot of other things now, is a kind of a correct identification of the harm and a wrong identification of what's causing it or what will solve it. So, there are plenty of problems online, but I think we feel, and I think it sounds like you do as well, that we're playing this funny little whack-a-mole game where whatever the problem is, somebody's sliding in to say that 230 is the reason they have that problem, when a lot of times it has to do with something, not related. It could even be, in many cases, the U.S. Constitution, but also kind of misidentifying.
Cindy, there's a great story that I sometimes tell. The New York Times one day had a big picture of Chris Cox and I. It was practically a full-length page. I'm 6'4", went to college on a basketball scholarship, dreaming of playing in the NBA. And they said, these two people are responsible for all the hate information online, and 230 empowered people to do it. And we hardly ever do this, but Keith Chu, our wonderful expert on all things technology, finally touched base with them and said, that if there was no 230, over 95% of what we see online that we really dislike, misogyny, hate speech, racism, would still be out there because of the First Amendment, not 230. Yeah. And the New York Times, to its credit, printed a long, long apology, essentially the next day, making the case that was really all about the First Amendment, not 230. 230 brought added kind of features to this, particularly the capacity to moderate, which was so important in a new opportunity to communicate.
What drives you towards building a better internet? So many people in Congress in your town don't really take the time to figure out what's going on, much less propose real solutions. They kind of, we've been in this swing where they treated the technologies like heroes, and now we're in a time when they're treating them like villains. But what drives you to kind of figure out what's actually going on and propose real solutions?
Well, I showed up, Cindy, Oregon's first new United States senator in 34 years, in 1996, the winner. And the only person who knew how to use a computer at that point was Pat Leahy, who was a great advocate of technology and innovation. I said, I'm going to get into new stuff. In other words, Oregon had always been about wood products. We always will be about wood products, and I will continue to champion those kinds of practices, particularly now working to prevent these huge fires. I also said, we're going to get into new things. And my dad was a journalist, and he said, you're not doing your job if you don't ask hard questions every single day. So what we tried to do, particularly in those first days, is kind of lay the foundation, do the foundational principles for the internet. I mean, there's a book Jeff Kossoff wrote, 26 Words That Created the Internet. Yes. But we also had internet tax policy to promote non-discrimination, so you wouldn't be treated different online than you would be offline. Our digital signatures law, I think, has been a fabulous, addition. People used to spend hours and hours in offices, kind of signing these documents that look like 5 phone books stacked on top of each other, and they'd be getting through it in 15, 20 minutes. So to me, what I think we showed is that you could produce more genuine innovation by thinking through what was to come than just lining the pocketbooks of these big entrenched interests. Now, a big part of what we're going to have to do now with AI is go through some of those same kinds of issues. I think, for example, we're all in on beating China. That's important. We're all in on innovation, but we've got to make sure that we cement bedrock, privacy and accountability. And that's really what's behind the Algorithm Accountability Act, because, what we wanted to do when people were getting ripped off in terms of housing and education and the like with AI, we wanted to get them basic protection.
It sounds like you're already thinking about this new thing, AI, and in the, 20 or more years ago, you were thinking about the new thing, which is posting online. How do we get more of your colleagues to sort of have that same impulse to be interested in tackling those hard questions that you mentioned? I think we always wonder what's missing from their views, and we just don't really know how to make them sort of wake up to the things that you get.
What we do is particularly focus on getting experienced and knowledgeable and effective staff. I tell people I went to school on a basketball scholarship. I remember recruiting. We kind of recruit our technologists like they were all LeBron James and kind of talking about, why there were going to be opportunities here. And we have just a terrific, staff now, really led by Chris Segoyan and Keith Chu, and it's paid huge dividends, for example, when we look at some of these shady data broker issues, government surveillance. I'm now, with the passing of my friend Dianne Feinstein, one of the most senior members in the intelligence, field. And these incredibly good staff, allow me to get into these issues. Right now, I'm with Senator Moran, Jerry Moran of Kansas, trying to upend the declassification system because it basically doesn't declassify anything. And I'm not sure they could catch bad guys, and they certainly are hanging on to stuff that is irresponsible information collection about innocent people.
These are all problems that, of course, we're very deep in. And we do appreciate that our friend Chris Segoyan, who EFF's known for a long time, and other people you've brought in, really good technologists and people who understand technology to advise you. How do we get more senators to do that too? Are there things that we could help build that would make that easier?
I think there are. And I think we need to do more, not postmortems, but sort of more after action kind of analysis. For example, the vote on Sesta Fosta was 98-2.
Yeah.
And everybody wasn't sure where the other vote was. And Rand Paul came up to me and said, "You're right, so I'm voting with you." Yeah. And the point really was, everybody hated the scourge of sex trafficking and the like. I consider those people monsters.
Yep.
But I pointed out that all you're going to do is drive them from a place where there was transparency to the dark web where you can't get a search engine.
Yep.
And people go, well, Ron's telling us, that it's going to get worse. And then I offered an amendment to basically do what I think would have really made a difference there, which is get more prosecutors and more investigators going after bad guys.
Yep.
And the ultimate factor that would be good, as I say, to have these sort of after action, after legislating kind of things, is everybody said, well, you've got to have Sesta Fosta or you're never going to be able to do anything about Backpage. This was this horrible place that, there were real problems with respect to sex trafficking. And what happened was Backpage was put out of business under existing law,
Correct.
Not under Sesta Fosta. And
Correct.
When you guys have this discussion with, people who are following the program and ask them when their senator or congressperson last had a press conference about Sesta Fosta.
Yep.
I know the answer to this. I can't find a single press conference about Sesta Fosta, which was ballyhooed at the time as this miraculous cure for dealing with really bad guys. And the technology didn't make sense. And the education didn't make sense. And the history with Backpage didn't make any sense. And it was because people got all intoxicated with these, ideas that somehow they were going to be doing this wondrous, thing. And it really made things worse.
So I'm hearing three things in the better world. One, and the one you've just mentioned, is that we actually have real accountability, that when we pass some kind of regulation, we take the time to look back and see whether it worked, that we have informed people who are helping advise, or actually are, the lawmakers and the regulators who understand how things really work. And the third one is that we have a lot more accountability inside government around classification and secrecy, especially around things involving, national security. And, you're in this position, right, where you are read in as a member of the Intelligence Committee. And so you kind of see what the rest of us don't. And I'm wondering, obviously I don't want you to reveal anything, but, is that gap an important one that we close?
Yeah, there have been a lot of 14-1 votes in the Intelligence Committee over the years. And, I've been the one. And, the reality is people often get swept up in these kinds of arguments, particularly from people in government. Like, we're having a big debate about surveillance now, Section 702. And,
yes.
Everybody's saying, Ron, what are you talking about? You're opposing this. We face all these kinds of threats. And, what I've always said is that read the title of the bill, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. That means we're worried about foreign intelligence. We're not, under that law, supposed to be sweeping up the records of vast numbers of Americans who are interconnected to those foreign individuals by virtue of the fact that communication systems have changed. And I personally believe that smart policies ensure that you can fight terror ferociously while still protecting civil liberties, and not so smart policies give you less of both.
How do we get to that balance that you're talking about where, I know a lot of people feel like we do have to have some level of surveillance to protect national security, but that balance of protecting the individual rights of people is a complicated one. I'm wondering how you think about what that looks like for people.
Well, for example, Zoe Lofgren, Zoe has been a partner of mine on many projects. I know she's been sympathetic with all of you for many years in her service as a member from California. What we said, our 702 reforms, and by the way, we had a whole bunch of Republicans, there needs to be a warrant requirement.
Yes.
If you're going after the personal data of Americans, there should be a warrant requirement. Now,
Yep.
We were then asked, well, what happens if it's some kind of imminent kind of crisis? And I said, what I've always said is that all my bills, as it relates to surveillance, have a warrant exception, which is if the government believes that there is an imminent threat to the security of our country and our people, the government can go up immediately and come back and settle the warrant matter afterwards. And at one point, I was having a pretty vigorous debate with the president and his people, then President Obama. And I said, Mr. President, if the warrant requirement exception isn't written right, you all write it, and I'm sure we'll work it out. But I think that giving the government a wide berth to make an assessment about whether there is a real threat to the country, and they're prepared to not only go up immediately to get the information, but to trust the process later on to come back and show that it was warranted, I think it's a fair balance. That's the kind of thing I'm working on right now.
Let's pause for just a moment to say thank you to our sponsor. How to Fix the Internet is supported by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation's program in public understanding of science and technology, enriching people's lives through a keener appreciation of our increasingly technological world and portraying the complex humanity of scientists, engineers, and mathematicians. And now back to our conversation with Senator Ron Wyden and his work on privacy laws.
Really, the first big law that I got passed involved privacy rights of Americans outside the country. So we had won a bunch of battles before that, defeating John Poindexter, total information awareness, and variety of other battles. But when I started this, trying to protect the privacy rights of Americans who are outside the United States, you would have thought that Western civilization was going to end. And this was the Bush administration. And the DNI, the head of national intelligence, talked to me and said, Ron, this is just going to be disastrous, be horrible. And I walked him through who we were talking about. And I said, the biggest group of people we're talking about are men and women who wear the uniform of the United States because they are outside the United States. You can't possibly be telling me, Director McConnell at that time, that they shouldn't have privacy rights. And then things kind of moved, and I kept working with them, and they still said that this was going to be a tremendous threat and all the rest. They were going to veto it. They actually put out a statement about there would be a veto message. So I worked with them a little bit more, and we worked it out. And when we were done, the Bush administration put out something, and we are proud to say that we are protecting the privacy rights of Americans outside the United States. So if you can just take enough time and be persistent enough, you can get things done. And now we actually have elected officials and presidents of both political parties all taking credit for the privacy rights of people outside the United States. A yes or no answer to the question, does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently, perhaps, collect, but not wittingly.
All right.
That's a clip from C-SPAN with a pretty famous interaction you had with James Clapper in 2013. But I think the thing that really shines through is your ability to walk this fine line. You're very respectful of the system, even in an instance like this where someone is lying under oath right into your face, and you know you have to work within the system in order to make change. How do you navigate that in the face of things like lies and misdirection?
Well, you have to take the time to really tee it up, and I really credit John Dickus of Oregon, our staffer at the time, did a phenomenal job. He spent about 6 months teeing that question up for Mr. Clapper. And what happened is his deputy, Mr. Clapper's deputy, Keith Alexander, had been telling what my 11-year-old daughter, my wife and I are older parents, we have this 11-year-old, she said, Dad, that was a big whopper. That guy told a big whopper. Keith Alexander told a bunch of whoppers, and then Mr. Clapper did, and this had all been done in public, and so we asked for answers. He wouldn't give any answers. Then he came to the one, open threat hearing that we have each year, and we prepare for those open threat hearings like there is no tomorrow, because you don't get very many opportunities to have a chance to ask, the important questions. And so John Dickus sent to Mr. Clapper, he sent him the question a day in advance so that nobody could say that they hadn't gotten it. And it's an informal rule in the Intelligence Committee that if an official feels that they can't answer, they just say, I can't answer, I have to do it in private. I wouldn't have liked that answer, but I would have respected it and tried to figure out some other way. But James Clapper got the question, looked at the camera, looked at me, and just lied and persisted in coming up. He had like 5 or 6 excuses for how he wasn't lying. And I think as the country found out what was going on, it was a big part of our product to produce the next round of laws that provided some scrutiny over the Patriot Act.
I think that's a really important kind of insight, right? Which is the thing that led to people being upset about the kind of massive surveillance and understanding it was kind of the lie, right? Like if there was more transparency on the part of the national security people and they didn't just tell themselves that they have to lie to all the rest of us, in order to keep us safe, which I think is a very, very dangerous story in a democracy, we might end up in a much more reasonable place for everyone about privacy and security. And I actually don't think it's a balance. I think that you only get security if you have privacy rather than they have to be traded off against them. And I think
you're a Ben Franklin person, Cindy. Anybody who gives up liberty to have security doesn't deserve either.
Well, I think that that's kind of right. But I also think that, the history has shown that the intense secrecy, overbroad secrecy actually doesn't make us safer. And I think this goes back to your point about accountability, where we really do need to look back and say these things that have been embraced as allegedly making us safer, are they actually making us safer, or are we better off having a different role for secrecy? Not that there's no role, but then the one that has been, it's an all-purpose excuse that no matter what the government does, it just uses the secrecy argument to make sure that the American people can't find out, so that we don't, evaluate whether things are working or not. I just don't think that my experience watching these things, and I don't know about yours, is that the overblown secrecy isn't actually making us safer.
Before we wrap up, we wanted to get a sense from you of what issues you see coming in the next 3 years or so that we're going to need to be thinking about to be ahead of the game. What's at the top of your mind looking forward?
The impact of the Dobbs decision repealing Roe versus Wade is going to have huge ripple effects through our society.
Yep.
I believe, women are already having their personal information weaponized against them.
Yes.
And you're seeing it in states with, MAGA attorneys general, but you're also seeing it. We did a big investigation of pharmacies.
Yes.
And pharmacies are giving out women's personal information hither and yon. And, we're very much committed to getting privacy rights here. And I also want to congratulate EFF on your Who's Got Your Back report, because you really are touching on these same kinds of issues. And I think getting a warrant ought to be really important. And the other one I mentioned is fighting government censorship. And I would put that both at home and abroad. It's no secret that China, Russia, and India want to control what people can say and read. But, if you look at some of what, we're seeing in this country, the U.S. Trade Representative taking a big step, backwards in terms of access to information. We're going to have to deal with that here in our country, too.
Oh, those are wonderful and scary, but wonderful and important things. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. It's always such a pleasure. And we are huge fans of the work that you've done. And thank you so much for carrying, the I-Square, individuals and innovation. Those are two values close to our hearts here at EFF. And we really appreciate having you in Congress championing them as well.
I don't want to make this a bouquet tossing contest, but we've had a lot of opportunities to work together, and EFF is part of the Stepping Up Caucus, and really appreciate it. And let's put this into to be continued. Okay.
Terrific.
Thanks, guys.
I really could talk with Senator Wyden all day, and specifically talk with him about national security all day, but what a great conversation. And it's so refreshing to have somebody who's experienced in Congress who really, is focusing on two of the most important things that EFF focuses on as well. I love the framing of I-Squared, right? Individuals and innovation as the kind of centerpiece of a better world.
Yeah, and he's not just saying it. It's clear from his bills and his work over the years that he really does center those things. Innovation and individuals are really the core of things like Section 230 and many other pieces of legislation that he's worked on, which it's just really nice and refreshing to hear someone who has a really strong ethos in the Senate and has the background to show that he means it.
Yeah, and sometimes we disagree with Senator Wyden,
Sure.
but it's always refreshing to feel like, well, we're all trying to point in the same direction. We sometimes have disagreements about how to get there.
Yeah, and one of the great things about working with him is that, he and his staff are tech savvy, so our disagreements are often pretty nuanced, at least from what I can remember. we aren't having disagreements about what a technology is or something like that very often. I think we're usually having really good conversations with his folks because he's one of the most tech-savvy staffers in the Senate, and he's helped really make the Senate more tech-savvy overall.
Yeah, I think that this is one of these pieces of a better internet that feels kind of indirect, but is actually really important, which is making sure that our lawmakers, they don't all have to be technologists. We have a couple technologists in Congress now, but they really have to be informed by people who understand how technology works. And I think one of the things that's important when we show up a lot of the times is really, having a clear ability to explain to the people, whether it's the congressional people themselves or their staff, like how things really work. And having that kind of expertise in-house is, I think, something that's going to be really important if we're going to get to a better internet.
Yeah, and it's clear that we have still work to do. He brought up Sesta Fosta.
Yes.
And that's an instance where he understands and his staff understands that was a bad bill, but it was still, as he said, 98-2 when it came to the vote. And ultimately that was a tech bill. And I think if we had even more sort of tech savvy folks, we wouldn't have had such a fight with that bill.
And I think that he also pointed to something really important, which was this idea of after analyses, after action thinking, and looking back and seeing, well, we passed this thing. Did it do what we had hoped it would do, as a way to really have a process where we can do error correction? And, I noted that, Ro Khanna and Elizabeth Warren have actually, and Senator Wyden, have floated a bill to have a investigation into FOSTA SESTA, which, for those who don't know the shorthand, this was a way that Section 230 was cut back and protection was cut back. And the idea is that it could help stop sex trafficking. Well, all the data that we've seen so far is that it did not do that, and in some ways made sex trafficking, in the offline environment more dangerous. But having Congress actually step in and do and sponsor the research to figure out whether the bill that Congress passed did the thing that they said is, I think, just a critical piece of how we decide what we're going to do in order to protect individuals and innovation online.
Yeah. For me, it's actually tied to something that I know a lot of tech teams do, which is like a sort of postmortem. Yeah. After something happens, you really do need to investigate how we got there, what worked and what didn't. But in this case, we all know, at least at EFF, that this was a bad bill.
Yeah, sometimes it might be just taking what we know anecdotally and turning it into something that Congress can more easily see and digest. I think the other thing, it's just impossible to talk with or about Senator Wyden without talking about national security, because he has just been heroic in his efforts to try to make sure that we don't trade privacy off for security, and that we recognize that these two things are linked, and that by lifting up privacy, we're lifting up national security, and by reducing privacy, we're not actually making ourselves safer. And he really has done more for this. And I think what was heartening about this conversation was that, he talked about how he convinced national security hawks to support something that stood with privacy, this story about kind of really talking about how most of the Americans abroad are affiliated in one way or another with the U.S. military, people who are stationed abroad and their families, and how standing up for their privacy and framing it that way, ultimately led to some success for this. Now, we've got a long ways to go, and I think he'd be the first one to agree, but the kind of doggedness and willingness to be in there for the long haul and talk to the national security folks about how these two values support each other is something that he has really proven that he's willing to do, and it's so important.
Yeah, that's exactly right, I think, as well. And it's also terrific that he's looking to the future.
Yes.
We do know that he's thinking about these things. 702 has been an issue for a long time, and he's still focused on it. But what did you think of his thoughts about what our coming challenges are? Things like how to deal with data in a post-Dobbs world, for example.
Oh, I think he's right on it. He's recognizing, I think, as a lot of people have, that the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade has really made it clear to a lot of people how vulnerable we are based upon the data that we have to leave behind in what we do every day. Now, you can do things to try to protect them, but there's only so much we can do right now without changes in the law and changes in the way things go, because, your phone needs to know where you are in order to ring when somebody calls you or ping when somebody texts you. So we need legal answers, and he's correct that this is really coming into the fore right now. I think he's also thinking about the challenges that artificial intelligence are bringing. So I really appreciate that he's already thinking about how we fix the internet in the coming years, not just right now.
I'm really glad we had this bouquet throwing contest, I think was what he called it. Something like that. But yeah, I think it's great to have an ally and have them be in the Senate. And I know he feels the same way about us.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, part of the way we get to a better internet is to recognize the people who are doing the right things. And so, we spend a lot of time at EFF throwing rocks at the people who are doing the wrong thing. And that's really important too. But occasionally, we get to throw some bouquets to the people who are fighting the good fight.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of How to Fix the Internet. If you have feedback or suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. Visit EFF.org/podcast and click on listener feedback. You can also read transcripts of each episode or get resources to learn more about each guest and the topics that we're covering. While you're there, you could also perhaps become an EFF member, maybe pick up some merch, and just see what's happening in digital rights this week and every week. We've got a newsletter, effector, as well as social media accounts on many, many different platforms. This podcast is licensed Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International and includes music licensed Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 Unported by their creators. In this episode, you heard Kalte Oren by Alex and Drops of H2O, the filtered water treatment by Jay Lang featuring Airtone. Our theme music is by Nat Keefe of Beatmower with Reed Mathis, and How to Fix the Internet is supported by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation's Program in Public Understanding of Science and Technology. We'll talk to you again soon. I'm Jason Kelley.
And I'm Cindy Cohen.